Well, Light and Heat, a passion for the holiness of God is the conference theme this weekend. And it's something that we come back to because it defines so much of Ligonier Ministries. Take us back. What first got you interested in the subject?
I would say that my interest in the holiness of God, Chris, goes back over 50 years, about 54 years actually, to the first 2 weeks of my Christian experience. I had grown up in a church that was quite a liberal church, and there was not much Bible teaching. Our interest in the church was chiefly social. That's where Vesta and I learned how to dance in the church basement, and I praise God for that. But when I was converted suddenly in my freshman year of college, I opened the Bible for the first time in my life, and it was like a novel. I read through the whole Bible in the first 2 weeks of my Christian experience, and my first interest in the holiness of God came out of that 2 weeks. My virgin reading of the Old Testament particularly exposed me to a God of whom I really had never heard. At that time in my life, I'd never heard, for example, of Abraham or of Isaac or of Jacob. If you asked me who wrote the Gospels, I probably would have said Matthew, Mark, Luther, and John. Something like that. And so my virgin reading of the Old Testament was not a surprise. It was a shock. I couldn't believe what I was reading about the revelation of the nature and the character of God. And yet, as I was reading this unveiling of the God of the Old Testament, I didn't struggle with it at all, like many people do who want to expurgate the references to Yahweh and reconstruct a God more politically correct and more according to our liking, where his love triumphs over everything, as one recent pastor has written. Instead of understanding with his view, sin triumphs over everything. But as I was reading about this God, though there was so much I didn't understand, it came across very clearly that this is the God who is, and that this is the God who had just forgiven me of my sins through Jesus. And I vividly recall walking the halls of my freshman dormitory at 3 o'clock in the morning. The place was totally silent. The halls were made out of tile, and so my feet on the floor would echo through the halls. And I just paced up and down like a caged lion in that hall, wrestling like Jacob at Peniel with this God. Not that I was wrestling against submitting to him, but realizing that, hey, if I'm going to be a Christian, I have to be a Christian all the way. Because obviously this God of the Old Testament is a God who plays for keeps. And that was just the beginning, Chris, of that. But that initial impact of God's revelation that I had in the beginning days of my conversion left an indelible mark on my soul and on my mind that is with me to this day. But I have to then go forward a year to the next chapter of my developing understanding of God. Since after my conversion, I decided to major in Bible, and in my freshman year, I had a course in Old Testament, a course in New Testament, by a professor who was not in the Bible department. He was the head of the philosophy department, but because they had a student overload and because he had a degree in theology as well as one in philosophy, I had been assigned to his section, and also through the lottery of the faculty, he was assigned as my faculty advisor, which was one of the greatest gifts God ever gave to me. But I had to choose a course from the social studies section of the curriculum. And that meant psychology, sociology, or philosophy, and I didn't know anything about any of those things. But because my professor was the head of the philosophy department, I opted for Introduction to Philosophy. And I got into class, and I'll never forget, the first reading assignment we had was a segment of David Hume's Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. And I didn't have a whole lot of human understanding of what David Hume was talking about. I mean, I had never heard the word empiricism, and I didn't know what a sense perception was from a loaf of bread. I mean, I just was completely lost in that first assignment, and not only lost, but abysmally bored by it. And it went on. It got worse with John Stuart Mill and others. And so I would go to class, and in those days, I used to send away to the Billy Graham organization. He published these little pamphlets, which were transcripts of his sermons. And so I would go to my philosophy class, and I would sit in the back row, and I would open up my notebook, and I would fold inside the notebook a Billy Graham sermon, because I wanted to have something edifying during that time. And listening to the lectures of philosophy did not seem very edifying to me. But shortly into the course, the professor came to St. Augustine. And Augustine's view of creation. And as the lecture started to develop, I couldn't help but overhear some of the things he was saying. And I put down the Billy Graham sermon, and I started to listen. And the professor explained Augustine's view of God creating through the divine imperative, or the divine fiat, by bringing the universe into existence by the power of his voice, saying, "Let there be," and there was. And it was almost a second conversion. Don't get sunk in this bad theology, but there only is one regeneration and one conversion. But it was like, and this is just an analogy, it was like my initial conversion had been a conversion to Jesus, to the second person of the Trinity. And I understood, vaguely at least, that what Jesus had done was to save me from the wrath of his Father and to reconcile me to his Father. And so I knew God the Father that this was a Trinitarian business that I was involved in as a Christian. But I really had never understood the depths of, I still don't understand the depths of the character and nature of God the Father. But in that lecture, where Augustine was focusing on the power of God and his being, it was a watershed moment in my life, because now it was like my mind was captured by a vision of God that had been lacking in my early days as a Christian. And being an impulsive person, and so moved by that I left that class and went downstairs to the registrar's desk and changed my major to philosophy. And I still took every course in Bible that I could take, but I had to go. I mean, my whole pursuit of philosophy was driven, and I was a driven man at that point, was driven by a hunger and thirst to be able to know God more deeply and understand him more clearly in my mind.
We're glad you changed your major. And
well, not everybody's glad.
how did that inform your early ministry then, once you moved from college to seminary?
Well, when I went to seminary, these ideas that initiated with Augustine were extremely deepened by my seminary experience, because in seminary, I had the opportunity, even before seminary in philosophy, and also I studied Aquinas and Anselm, Athanasius, and the giants of the Christian faith throughout the ages. A little bit of Calvin, but in seminary I got immersed in Calvin and Luther, and particularly Jonathan Edwards, because my professor there was an expert on Edwards, Dr. Gershner. And one time I read an introductory essay to Athanasius De Incarnationis, written by C.S. Lewis. And that essay appeared later in his book with a series of essays called God in the Dock. And in that he talked about how, though these different giants of church history had distinctive views in their theology, there are things that are in Aquinas that aren't in the other guys, and things unique to Augustine, things unique to Athanasius and Anselm and Luther and Calvin. They all had their unique imprint that you could distinguish one from the other. But Lewis observed that there was at the same time, a certain sameness at critical points where they all came together. And one of those critical points was that all of these giants of the church were intoxicated by the majesty of God. Their thinking was controlled by God's self-disclosure in Scripture. And I'm talking about God the Father here. And, I used to teach in the seminary. I used to teach what's called theology proper. Now, I know there are lots of theologians that teach improper theology, but what theology proper means is focusing on the doctrine of God, the Father. And actually, in the subdivisions of systematic theology, though I love Christology and I love soteriology, nothing was more meaningful to me than the segments on the study of theology proper. And I would always start off my lectures on theology proper with the incomprehensibility of God, and at the same time I would say something paradoxical, which made some of my students think that I was drifting towards neo-orthodoxy, but there was enough wood in the ocean to stop that drift from ever going anywhere. So I would say to them, when we look at Reformed theology, and you look at the historic Reformed confessions, it's very clear that there's nothing particularly unique about our confession of the nature and character of God from what you would find in Lutheran confessions, Episcopalian confessions, Methodist confessions, even Roman Catholic confessions. We all agree that God is self-existent, that He's eternal, that He's simple, that He is omniscient and omnipotent and omnipresent, and all those other attributes that we string together with respect to our idea of God. And so I said, there's nothing really particularly unique about our doctrine of God. And then I would then go on to the paradoxical statement. I said, however, if anybody asked me what was the overwhelming distinctive character of Reformed theology, I would say it's our doctrine of God. And then people not used to hearing me play with paradox would look at me like I just made a mistake in speaking. And I know what those look like because I see them often, but you're supposed to laugh at that. But I'm not supposed to laugh. And that's one of the things my doctor told me I'm not allowed to do, is to laugh, and didn't want me to be involved in conversations. And I told that to Steve Larson. I said, I can't talk to you at all, because if I talk to you, I'll be guilty of both talking and laughing, because you can't say anything that isn't funny. And even worse is Sinclair, who wounded my ribs last year with his humor. But in any case, where was I? Reformed theology. I said, what I mean by that is this, that on our first page of our theology is our doctrine of God. But the thing about Reformed theology is that when we get to page 2, we don't forget what we said on page 1. That Reformed theology informs every other doctrine. That's why doctrine is systemic. And our doctrine of God informs our doctrine of Christ. It informs our doctrine of the atonement. It informs our doctrine of salvation. It informs our doctrine of sin. It informs every aspect of our theology. And so it is the control mechanism for all of our Christian thought, is how we understand who God is. Then when we started the study center years ago, I had a friend who came in, and he was trying to help us work out a mission statement and asking me leading questions to that end. And he said, well, now, what is it that you want to teach that people in the world don't know? And I said, that's easy. I want to be able to teach people who God is. I mean, I know they already know that God is, because God has made clear of that through his general revelation, which I'll talk about, God willing, tomorrow morning. But I said, but they don't know who he is. And what I see as our mission chiefly is to try to unfold God's revelation of himself so that people can come to an understanding of who God is. Let me back up just a second, back to my college days. When I was in college, it was when it appeared the first really runaway, best-selling paraphrase of the New Testament, which was written by J.B. Phillips. And at the same time, J.B. Phillips wrote a little monograph entitled, Your God is Too Small. And I remember reading that as a college student and being impacted by that as well. That is exactly the problem, that as we begin our Christian walk as spiritual infants, we don't really grow to the fullness of conformity to the image of Christ until we gain the mind of Christ. And to have the mind of Christ is to think like Jesus. And Jesus' thoughts were altogether theocentric. His thoughts were dominated by thoughts of the Father, of his being, of his character, of his will, of his purpose, of his mission. And that has to be duplicated in the lives of Christians. That for us to grow in grace, we have to grow in our knowledge of God. Not just so that we can puff up our intellect and become proud of our learning, but that we may know him. And the old saying is, the more we know him, the more we love him. And the more we love him, the greater our capacity is to serve him, to worship him, to honor him, and to obey him. So this is just absolutely key to the Christian life. So anyway, back to this man who asked me what the big picture was. And I said, just to help people, come to help people find out who God is. And he says, well, that's fine for the secular person, but what do you think's the most important thing you need to teach Christians? And I said, that's easy. And he said, what's that? And I said, to find out who God is, because that's the biggest problem in our churches. Our worship, our church experience, our church life is driven by our understanding of the nature of God. If we have a low view of God, we'll have a low view of the church. If we have a low view of God, we'll have a low view of worship. If we have a high view of God, then we will have a high view of reverence and adoration. Worship will never, ever be casual when we understand who God is. Our prayers will never, ever be superficial if we come to understand who it is to whom we are speaking and who we are who are doing the speaking in our prayers. And so that everything in the Christian life is conditioned and determined by that central understanding of the character of God. Now, back to what I was saying about C.S. Lewis and the sameness that he found in the giants of the faith. Again, as I said, when I was in seminary, I was introduced in a new way, in a deeper way, to Luther, to Calvin, and to Edwards. And all three of those men were profoundly different, each from the other two, in their own way. And of the three, existentially, I most identified with Luther. Luther was kind of a profane Christian, and I understood that because that's who I was, and that's the kind of thing I came out of, and I really identified with Luther's struggles when he was in the monastery, when he was overwhelmed by a sense of his relentless guilt, because Luther understood the holiness of God. And Luther was not able to deceive himself and put up these rationalizations as a shield to protect himself from the penetrating conviction of the character of God. If ever a man knew that he was a sinner, it was Martin Luther. And he, on one occasion, was asked the question, "Do you love God?" And he said, "Love God? Sometimes I hate him." And what he was bearing in his soul was that of the deepest existential feeling of any sinful creature. Nothing is more odious to a sinner than a being who is altogether holy. We can't stand it. That's why we don't want God in our thinking, in our natural fallen condition, because God's holiness destroys us. And then, of course, it was that relentless holiness that drove him to the cross, that drove him to Christ and for his redemption. and when he realized what Christ had done for him by giving him righteousness, Christ's own righteousness to Luther, that meant so much to Luther, to be forgiven and to be clothed by that righteousness, that he was willing to stand against the whole world for the sake of the gospel. And, the rest of that is history. And if you want to know that, you talk to Bob Godfrey. He knows about all things historical. Even the dying words of Mae West that I heard this afternoon. And
let me
stop cackling. You're not allowed to do that.
Yeah, no laughing.
What?
When did
I'm not done.
Oh, okay.
Where was I?
You were at Luther.
I was at Luther, but I'm not done with Luther. I want to talk about Calvin.
All right.
But I identified so much with Luther, and a lot of the things that Chris had to say is over the years, because I'm always harping on the holiness of God, and whenever I get a chance to preach one time at a church, I'll always preach on that subject. And because of that, some people think, wow, you must really be a holy man to have such a captivating interest in the holiness of God. I said, no, you don't understand me at all. I'm like Luther. I know that I'll do everything in my power to fool myself and to think that I'm having some semblance of righteousness, that is all it is a semblance, it's a shadow, it's not the real thing. And my natural tendency as a sinner is the same as anybody else's, is to try to bring God's standard down as low as I possibly can so to get closer to where I am. I want to exaggerate my own achievements and diminish God's glory so that they can come closer together. But when I study the holiness of God, then that's a corrective to my natural. In other words, what I'm saying is that the reason I love the holiness of God is not because I'm holy, but because I'm not. And I need that in order to make any progress in my Christian life. Now, at that point is where Calvin, at the very beginning of the Institutes, I go back to that over and over again. And if you have never read Calvin's Institutes, throw away all your misconceptions about Calvin as being mean and spirited and nasty and all of that. Never was a heart more tender for God than John Calvin. And of the three, I mean, his systematic understanding of theology is without parallel among the three, Luther and Edwards. And both Luther and Edwards owed a lot to Calvin. But you read Calvin's Institutes and you're just transported into the presence of God, and particularly in the early pages where he talks about us, that we examine ourselves from the perspective of this world, where we keep our gaze fixed below, where we think our vision is more than adequate, when in the light of the sun behind us we look at objects here on the ground and we think we're endowed with a keen eyesight and that we have everything clearly perceived. until that moment that we turn our gaze directly to the sun and we're blinded by the refulgence and the brightness of it, and we can't stand to look at it any closer. And then we realize that the sight that we thought we had that was so great on terrestrial levels was only dim, bare reflections compared to the heavenly matter. And he said, while our eyes are fixed on this world, we look at ourselves in that perspective and flatter ourselves and consider ourselves as slightly less than demigods. But once we turn our gaze to heaven and consider what kind of a being God is, all of those conceptions are destroyed, and we are left, as Calvin said, as Scripture uniformly relates, that holy men of old, when they had a glimpse of the holiness of God, they were reduced to fear and trembling and tears and ruination. Because that's what the revelation of God does. That's what the holiness of God does. And that is life-changing, life-transforming. And so Calvin was just as driven by that passionate understanding for who God is as Luther was. And of course, if anybody takes it to the next level, it's Edwards. And I was first introduced to Jonathan Edwards in college, where we had a course in Introduction to American Literature. And our professor was not a Christian. And the textbook that we had was an anthology of American literature, and it went through it historically. And so the beginning section was 18th century literature, and it had copies of a sermon by Michael Wigglesworth entitled The Day of Doom, which is all about punishment and hell and all the rest. I don't know what you're trying to tell me to do. Clip my coat. Don't let my belly hang up. What do you want, honey? Huh? Oh, leave my hands alone. Okay. She who must be obeyed. All three things. Yeah, okay. You're not allowed to make me laugh, Vesta. You got to stop that. So, and then the other thing we had was the sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And that was my first exposure to Edwards, reading that sermon. And of course, the professor went on, as did the textbook author, about this was the sample of the frontier emotionalism and hellfire and damnation, and that Edwards was sadistic and all of that because he enjoyed tormenting people about hell. That's not how I read the sermon. First of all, I thought if there was anything true of Jonathan Edwards, it was that he believed in hell. And if he were sadistic, he would have told people there wasn't a hell and take delight in preparing them for that place. Instead, Edwards cared deeply about his congregation. And the two words that were used more often than any of his manuscripts were the words lovely and excellence. And he was intoxicated by the sweetness of Christ and the loveliness of Christ and of God and the excellence of God. And in that sermon, Sinners in the Hands of Angry God, when I read it, I saw the accent was on the hand that was holding the sinner from falling into the pit of hell. And that it was a sermon of grace. I saw myself being supported by that hand, and the only thing that kept that strand of the spider web from being severed and dropping me into the pit was the grace of God. And that left a tremendous impact on me, so that I was interested more in studying Edwards. When I got to seminary there, I'm studying under a world expert on Edwards, and Dr. Gerstner, and I had courses in Edwards and got immersed in Edwards' theology, his divine and supernatural light, the sermon that brought him into prominence in New England. And Edwards, of course, I believe, as the Encyclopedia Britannica said, that he was America's greatest intellectual and greatest philosopher theologian ever. And he was brilliant and at the level of an Augustine. He was far more brilliant than Luther or Calvin. He was up there with Aquinas and Augustine and, but Francis Turret as well. And Edwards' mind would take you into realms where nobody else would wander. I remember reading his sermon on Gethsemane and on the agony of Jesus sweating blood. And beyond that, his sermon on 1 John, where we will be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Listen to Reed Edwards talk about the beatific vision, the Visio Dei, the vision of God, and how in heaven we'll be able to contemplate God immediately. That all of our knowledge now comes through our senses, of the external world, comes through our senses, and our senses learn things through mediation, through mediated objects. I see Sinclair sitting there, and I see with my eyes, I see he's wearing a suit and a tie and all of that. But I don't have a direct perception of his mind or of his being. All I can see are the outward appearances. I can't see his heart. I can't see his soul. He can't see my soul. We have to talk with each other to get anywhere with that kind of understanding. But when we will see God, God is not a body, and that this perception will not be empirical. It will be immediate, that I will have an immediate knowledge in my mind, immaterial understanding to the immaterial God. And when Edwards explores that, you're on a spaceship to glory. And that kind of thinking about God radiates throughout Edwards' writings. And this is the same testimony you'll hear from John Piper. John Piper was arrested, stopped, in his tracks by Edwards. And I have a friend here in Lake Mary who's the sheriff of Lake Mary, and I was having lunch with him one day, and he talked about people who arrived at the hospital DOA, dead on arrival. And then he said, but we have other cases where we have victims who are DRT. And I said, what's DRT? What's the difference between DRT and DOA? He says, well, DOA is dead on arrival, DRT is dead right there. That's what happened to me with Edwards. I was dead right there. You get slain by that kind of study.
Let me ask you then, Isaiah 6, when did that become locus classicus for your biblical exposition of the holiness of God?
I'm embarrassed about that question. Try to avoid it. If I stole that, I was at a conference. I used to do a conference for college students every year in Western Pennsylvania, Eastern Ohio, with John Guest and the Coalition for Christian Outreach. And at one of those conferences, I heard John Guest give a sermon on Isaiah 6 that I thought was the most stirring sermon I ever heard in my life. It really was. And of course, he stole it too. He stole it from his professor back in England, Alec Matier, who is a professor, Old Testament, and a great one. He's written a commentary on Isaiah. But that sermon from Isaiah 6 just captivated me, so that I went back and did my own work on it and studied further. Rudolf Otto's book on the idea of the holy, das Heilige, also had an impact on my understanding of that, and Isaiah 6. And so I put together a series of lectures back in the probably 1969 or 70, like 6 lectures on the holiness of God. And I gave that series first at Saranac Lake at a Young Life camp up in upstate New York at the beginning of the fall semester for their teachers that were doing stuff with high school seniors that were going off to college. And that was strange because I gave that series there, and there was a pastor there from Chattanooga who heard it. He got me down to Chattanooga. That's where I got involved with the McClellan Foundation. That's where I met, what's his name? Hug me, I've been mugged. Hug me, I've been mugged. What was his name? Mike Cromarty. He was president of the student body at Covenant College. And through that, I got to know Gordon Clark and Chuck Colson. All of that came through that first series of lectures on the holiness of God. And so I started doing that series here and around, and then some friends in Cincinnati came up on their vacation, and this fellow was in charge of video education for General Electric. They did video teaching programs for Israeli pilots on understanding the maintenance of jet engines that GE had been selling to the Israelis. And so this guy was an expert in educational video. And he came on his vacation, and I did this series on the holiness of God, and he videotaped it so he could take it back to his Bible study that he had in his home in Cincinnati. Well, before you know it, that started getting deposited around the country, and several more iterations of that were done on video.
Okay.
And the rest is history.
So that was the early 70s, carried on through the study center, and then the book was published in 1985, so just last year was our silver anniversary for Holiness.
I guess.
And so what did the publisher think when you came to them with this idea?
Publisher? I'm not sure I came to them with it, or that they came to me. I think they came to me, Chris, if I'm not mistaken, and wanted that in a book form.
Well, Tyndale has re-released the book with a new cover, new typesetting, and so we have that here. But they took the occasion to solicit some different feedback from people who have been impacted by this. David Wells, Derek Thomas, Mark Driscoll, Harry Reeder, Gerald Bray, Eric Alexander, and just being able to show the impact and the enduring relevance of this. What we see today in terms of the generation that's out there of younger evangelicals, what encourages you about that? And then what concerns you about the current generation of evangelicals as it would relate to understanding the doctrine of God?
I was very much moved and gratified by the response to the book and to the series. John MacArthur heard the series, and he told me that he was in the middle of an expository series on something else. And after he heard that, he said he had to stop what he was doing, and he changed themes and did a series on the holiness of God. Bill Hybels heard it in his car on a tape. It wasn't on the radio yet. And he said when he heard it, he pulled off the road and was weeping. And of course, Colson said he was on the floor with his face in the rug. And I mean, it's amazing to hear that kind of response. But again, it really wasn't a testimony to me. It's the subject matter. That is, Calvin said, Scripture uniformly relates that this is that kind of experience that people have. It's transforming because people are awakened to who God is, and the idols of our own making are shattered by that. And of course, I've been trying to give a heavy dose of that to broad evangelicalism all these years. I'm not at all happy where so-called evangelicalism is today. It's so bad that I don't like to even call myself an evangelical anymore, because the currency of that word has so been devalued over the last few decades that the meaning that it had historically has been all but obscured. But what we call the broadly evangelical church needs more than anything else, I think, an awakening of who God is. And we're seeing that. At the same time, broad evangelicalism is losing its force and is becoming almost mainline liberal. There's this resurgence of interest in the Puritans and the young, restless, reformed guys out there, and a greater interest in coming to these doctrines of grace, which are all founded in our understanding of the doctrine of God. So I'm very much encouraged by that, Chris. It's much stronger now than it was 40 years ago.